Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning. This is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started at about 1 p.m. Eastern. So stay tuned. We get started in about 10 minutes, 11 minutes. If you have questions, please put them in the comment section below. Start with the Q. And then if you want to share who you are and what company you're with and what you do, also do that in the comments so we can highlight you as well. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe. We'll get started in 11 minutes. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. This is Nick Shillon. We're going to get started in about 9 minutes. Stay tuned. We'll talk about Continuous ATO today and how to move at the pace of relevance with your accreditation. If you want to leave in the comments who you're with and what's your name and what you do, we'll be able to highlight you during the show as well. Thanks so much. Stay tuned. Bye-bye. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started in about 6-7 minutes. We'll talk about Continuous ATO today. So if you want to start asking questions in the comment section below, start your question with a Q so we know it's a question. And then if you want to share who you are and who you're with, we'll be able to highlight you as well. Stay tuned. We'll get started in about 6 minutes. Thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started about 4 or 5 minutes now for the first episode of this year, 2022. Happy New Year, everybody. We'll talk about Continuous ATO today, Authority to Operate, and how to move at the pace of relevance and deliver software multiple times a day. We'll get started in about 4 or 5 minutes. We have a great guest today to share with us insights on how they built what I think is the best product to help automate compliance. So we'll talk about that today, and please stay tuned. About 4 or 5 minutes. We have a lot of people joining now. If you have not yet registered and you want to get emails about the next shows, please do so at ama.preventbreach.com/register. Thanks so much. Stay tuned. 5 minutes. We'll get started. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. This is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started about 3 minutes. Stay tuned for the first episode of this year, and we're going to talk about continuous authority to operate. Today is going to be fun. We'll dig into it and have our guest share with us some insights as well. Stay tuned. We'll get started about 3 minutes. We'll share also the upcoming sessions coming this month and next month. I think you're going to be pretty excited about the guests coming on the show as well. Stay tuned. We'll get started soon. Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nick Chalon. We'll be today talking about continuous authority to operate with our guests. But before we get started, I wanted to share a few things. First, if you've missed and if you've not registered yet to the Nick of Time Show, you need to do that at ama.preventbreach.com/register. So please do that, so we're not dependent on LinkedIn for you to be able to see the next sessions and get an email with a link to be able to join the show. Also wanted to share a couple of things for the dates coming up. On the 25th, again at 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to get my dear friend Jason Weiss, the first DoD CSO, Chief Software Officer, to share his insights on the new Chief Digital and AI Office, and also DevSecOps and what the future looks like for the DoD CIO shop when it comes to software and DevSecOps. On February 1st at 1 p.m., we're going to get Preston Dunlap, the Chief Architect of the Air Force and Space Force, to share some insights on open architecture and the work he's been doing for the last few years to enable innovation across the department. And then we're going to have the dear Brian Finster on February 15th at 1 p.m. To talk about his thoughts on metrics and the DORA metrics, DevSecOps metrics, and he's going to share his background first at Walmart and now at Defense Unicorn for Platform One, to be able to enable the teams to understand where they're standing in terms of using the right metrics and how to measure success. But also after Brian, we're going to have another special guest, Lauren Notzenberger, the Air Force and Space Force CIO. So that's going to be fun. So you better join and ask your questions so we can really make sure that we keep them busy, okay? So share widely about those dates. We have a lot of people joining today, so we'll be highlighting you. Again, if you put your name and your company, what you do, we'll be able to highlight you. Unfortunately, if you block who you are on LinkedIn, sometimes we can't see it. So always put your name. As you can see here, we just don't know who is saying what. So always good to be able to do that. So again, if you have not registered for the AMA, please do that. Also wanted to point out people to the new LinkedIn page of the In the Nick of Time show. If you can follow the page too, we're trying to get to a pretty good number of followers, so we don't rely just on one account. And we're going to be posting also from that page a lot of insights and thoughts on what's happening in innovation software, DevSecOps, anything related to DoD as well. So please make sure you do that. And thanks, Joel, for highlighting again the link. Make sure you click on that link to register. Now, I want to maybe quickly give you a little bit of insights when it comes to the Continuous ATO. A lot of people, when we started this concept of Continuous ATO, looked, of course, at what was already happening in terms of continuous authorization, and looked at, of course, the legacy ATO process, right? And so when you look at that, you realize, of course, that the time it takes to get an ATO is kind of mind-boggling, often 6 months, sometimes more. And it's a very linear process, not automated, very manual, gets stale very quickly. In fact, every time I assessed an ATO when I was the Chief Software Officer in the Air Force Space Force, I realized pretty quickly that most of the information was stale and obsolete. And so I've yet to see an ATO documentation that would reflect the actual system in use, even for something as basic as port and protocol and just basic ingress of the system, and without even digging into the details of the bit of material and what's running on there. So pretty scary stuff, obviously. Not efficient. Security is kind of the afterthought. Really compliance driven, mapping to the NIST cybersecurity framework, but really down at the system level. So that means a lot of the modules and pieces are not really well assessed. So not awesome, and very much not enabling the continuous delivery of software in production. So we came up with this continuous ATO process. Initially, of course, Casaran and Lauren created this model. We kind of augmented it in partnership with UDCIO to really document it and make it something that can stick. And really, the goal is to be able to release software multiple times a day. And we wanted to divide and cut the work so it could be scaled across multiple teams. So we're not relying on very complex platforms to be able to do this, each in a vacuum. So, of course, trying to enable the reuse of platform one and other teams. So we cut it into kind of three buckets, right? The platform, the process, and the team. And these kind of two teams: the team that runs the platform and the team that build the software using the platform. So let's dig in a little bit into the three buckets here and see what's going on and what you need to have to get to a continuous ATO. The platform piece, of course, if you use platform one, you're already compliant day one. That's the beauty of using either Podibus or Big Bang. Big Bang, again, is open source. Anyone can go and grab it on repo1.dso.mil, and you can directly be able to get the source code and instantiate a replica of Big Bang on your cloud or on-premise environment. So the platform needs to be, of course, the software factory with a CI/CD pipeline. Use the hardened artifacts from Iron Bank. Be hosted in an already accredited environment, so you inherit the environment ATO, whether it's on premise, whether it's on the cloud, FedRAMP cloud, Gov cloud, whatever, right? So you get the cloud. You need to be compliant with the DevSecOps reference design. That's a version 2.1 now, so you need to be compliant with the required items, not the nice to have, but the required items there. And then you also need to have the continuous monitoring tools, right? So that's very important. Continuous monitoring tools to be able to track the logs and telemetry, have the SICA continuous security stack, which does the behavior detection and the enforcement of zero trust using the service mesh with Istio. So all these needs to be there day one, and that's kind of the foundation of the automation. And again, the factory and the platform is not just a development thing; it's also running in production, right? It's in the runtime, so it's part of the weapon. So when you run platform one, of course, you could have a development environment, but you also have a production environment with Big Bang, where you have that continuous monitoring there as well to continuously get the logs and telemetry and behavior detection and enforcement of zero trust down to the container level on that cluster as well. So if you use platform one, effectively the box number one is already checked. So you inherit all that day one. Now the process, of course, we talk about the gates of the pipeline, but also the continuous monitoring things we have to do. The gates of the pipelines, effectively, we have kind of three main gates: the change management gates, the testing gates, and the cyber gates. The change management gates, really, you're looking at how many set of eyes do you need to approve a merge request. If you're moving to GitOps and everything is code, you want to be able to release multiple times a day. So you put all your changes in code. So to approve a code change, you need 2-3 set of eyes, depending on the criticality of the change. You want to have, of course, the right numbers, never just one, to prevent insider threat or mistakes. So having, 2 people is a kind of a minimum, so that your change management enforcement all effectively done in pull request or merge request on Git. And then the testing gates cover kind of the test coverage, how much of your code is covered by tests in percentages. Your AO can define those percentages. It could say, hey, for that critical module here, you're going to have 100% test coverage, unit testing, integration testing, end-to-end testing. For something less important, maybe 75%. But again, the goal is to have a very high test coverage, so you're not breaking things while upgrading software. So that's your testing gates. And then your cyber gates are, the static dynamic analysis side of the house, the continuous scanning for CVEs, and all these common things. The runtime is going to be taken care of with the continuous monitoring piece, with the service mesh and the runtime monitoring of behavior detection. So all that is part of the process. So you define the thresholds by which the pipeline breaks, or by which the container gets killed in production, in runtime. Let's say it's starting to run commands it's never run before, and the behavior detection detects that and can kill the containers, go back to immutable state to prevent the malicious actor from retaining access to the system. and having kind of a moving target defense. That's why we kill containers every 4 hours to go back to cattle and immutable state. So everything done by the malicious actor gets lost, right? So that's a process, right? So that's the most important piece with your AAO. That's where you define the threshold. That's where you're going to say, hey, X% of test coverage, X number of eyes. I can't have findings higher than critical or high, higher than moderate or critical or high, based on the severity of the findings. How many days you have to fix it? How many days can you still deploy that artifact to production? So all these numbers, and so we built an appendix on the documentation to be able to list, hey, here's the kind of the appendix, the AO thresholds that you need to work with your AO on to define when to pass the pipelines, when to break the pipeline, when to kill containers already running, and things like that. So that's your process. And then you have the team. That's really the training of the team. So like I said, we have 2 teams. The team running the platform. So whoever is doing your operations of that day 1, day 2 instantiation of the platform. If you use Party Bus, that's platform 1. But if you instantiate your own Big Bang, that's your own team. And we have a special training for that to make sure all the site reliability engineering and all the day 2 ops is done right. So your platform is not getting stale. It's updated. It's not treated as a pet. You want to also treat your platform as cattle, upgrade it, tear it down, bring it back up, all these things, right? So very important stuff. And then you have the team building software, which is really what we want to do, which is using that platform. But the team building software does not have to worry about the instantiation of the DevSecOps pipeline and platform. That's taken care of by the other team. So there's also training there, to make sure they understand, test-driven development, TDD, user-centered design, all the DevOps culture, the flow, the feedback, the continuous learning. So great training there as well. And that's part of the requirements also to have, a CISO that can keep track of the findings and approve findings and potentially give waivers and all these different things. So that's the 3 things you need, for an ATO, continuous ATO. Now, when you look at the kind of move we're talking about, effectively we move from a snapshot in time, stock, stale, to automatically generated content, often dashboards that show the risk posture in real time. That could be aggregating content from your scanners, from different security products that effectively give you insights of the runtime and the findings and the cyber findings, the static code analysis findings, and so on. You can compute all that into a single dashboard and have something pretty cool like you see here on the bottom right. But effectively, it enables reuse of software, Lego blocks, reuse of containers. Of course, the platform can run on different environments, could be different clouds, on premise, on the weapon. And then the CI/CD thresholds effectively can be triggering an event to involve your ISSM or your SCA or your AO to look at the finding and see how to remediate that, and gives you a real-time security understanding of risk, right? And then because we use infrastructure as code and everything is GitOps and automated, everything gets consistent, secure, repeatable. You have your full disaster recovery and your full desired state in Git. So it's great for audits to look at, what was the state of the system 2 months ago and stuff like that. Effectively, that enables you to move to that automated risk determination, removing humans from the loop and defining kind of risk tolerance with your AO. So hopefully that helps. That's kind of what we've built for the last few years. Now we have a great special guest. I'm going to bring Rohit live. And here he is joining us from Security Compass. He's the CEO. He was a second full-time employee. He's going to tell us a little bit about some of his personal history and the company. In fact, Security Compass has this product called SD Elements. So you may not know the company name, but you may know the product because it's already widely used in DoD, both Kessel Run, the F-35 program, of course, Platform One, and others. So we use it to be able to automate the documentation process of controls and see which controls should be prioritized and how and when, based on the risk of the software and the kind of software we're building. So it does the mapping with NIST controls and all that good stuff. So let's get started, but just by asking Rohit to give us a little bit of insight about himself first, and then Rohit, if you want to also share a little bit about the company and when you created it. I believe you started on the commercial side and then looked into the government side. So love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Nick. I appreciate you having me on the show. Really looking forward to this. So just a little bit about myself. I started off as a computer science grad, graduated a dot-com bust, which was probably the worst time to be a computer science grad. But I found a job at a consulting company, and I had envisioned doing software development, but I ended up in security, not necessarily by choice. And I thought that those two worlds needed to come together. And this is at a time where application security was still relatively nascent. Sort of found a home in that company. And from there, I met Nish Bala, who was the founder of Security Compass. He was looking for somebody to join him as kind of the first full-time employee. I was young in my career. I decided it was worth doing. And this idea of application security seemed really interesting, seemed like it was poised to grow. And so I did. And so I joined him, Security Compass, in 2006. And we, at that time, were a security consultancy. So we help people with penetration testing and code reviews and training and that sort of thing. But one thing that we got a lot of was, how do I integrate security into the software development process? There was a sort of gap between this emerging field of static analysis, dynamic analysis, and training, security training for developers. There was nothing sort of in between. And what we saw were a lot of manual processes. So that was interesting for us. And over time, we started to realize that there was a product need there. And that was really the genesis of SD Elements. So actually, about a decade ago, really early stage, we started to see that some large software companies, some large banks had this need of integrating security into the software development process in a really repeatable, scalable way. And so we decided we were going to go build the product. And that's pretty much, what happened. It was sort of flew under the radar, I'd say, because we were working with really large companies and that had a very pronounced need. But fast forward a few years, and as the need started to become bigger, we got in through one of the innovation programs in the DoD and realized that there was a specific need for what we did and how it mapped to the ATO process, and we kind of just grew from there. So it's been an exciting journey. Happy to talk more about what we've done, but this is really our bread and butter now. We're a completely focused software company, and we help integrate security and compliance in by design, both in the commercial sector as well as in government.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I was very impressed with when I met the team, and just to be clear for everybody, none of the shows on In the Nick of Time are sponsored by companies. So we don't take sponsorship from companies. We invite people that we think bring a lot of value to the department of the warfighter. So I wanted people to be aware of that. I tell things how I think they are. No one is making me change my thoughts. So I was always intrigued when I started to hear about SD Element first at Kessa Run, when they say, hey, we have this tool we use to first look at the kind of application we're building, and it has this UI where you can select effectively kind of the type of applications you're building to down select or prioritize the right controls and do the mapping with other requirements as well. And then it can kind of do the creation of tickets into Jira, and then I can track the work we have to do to become secure and compliant. I mean, a lot of people, of course, still think of security as compliance focus, but I like to think of it as a real cyber guy and think of the security aspect of it. But the fact is, you can be compliant without being secure much harder. Sometimes you can also be secure and not compliant. So I think it's good to have kind of both sides of the house. And when I saw the UI at the time, I reached out to you and we got talking and talk about the Continuous ATO. At the time, it wasn't really well defined, and we're trying to build these layers. I don't know if you remember that meeting in the Pentagon, but we're trying to build layers, right? Where I say, hey, you need to change the product because right now you have this kind of one layer approach of the entire system. And the fact is, when you have dependencies or Lego blocks or microservices and teams are moving to cut software into Lego blocks, you end up having to almost think of it as each Lego block being able to inherit from the bottom layers, right? If you run on a service mesh, if you run on Kubernetes, if you run on a cloud, right, you inherit a lot of the controls from the foundation or the layers below it. And that was intriguing, and maybe you can share a little bit about what you understood from that discussion.
Yeah, well, I think your podcast, your I guess webinar is called In the Nick of Time, but sometimes I think you're ahead of your time. So I think Nick presented us this idea, and it was really intriguing because we hadn't heard a lot of requests or demands for this from the customer base at the time. But it was, it made a lot of sense logically, and so we started to look into it, and over time we heard more and more of this kind of thing happening organically, where people are talking about sort of composition of different components and then putting them together and inheriting security controls, whether it's from a compliance perspective or pure security perspective. What is the true work left for the DevOps team, and what do they have to do? So what we've been doing is actually, Nick has helped us to define a bit of a roadmap in terms of, what does a layered compliance view look like, and the idea of being able to define a bunch of components, particularly be able to take in the definition of a set of controls from, whether it's a popular open source or commercial component of some kind, and then say, the code that you're writing on top of those layers, what does it have to do? So we're in the midst of building that out. It's still technically capable in the product today, but we're enhancing it even further with with some of the suggestions and guidance from Nick.
Yeah, I always give people crazy ideas. Maybe too early, but I guess it's better be early than late. I don't know, but
absolutely. Totally agree.
So I guess you have a few. I wanted to make sure we get a little bit of a demo, right, or at least show us a little bit what the product looked like. So I know we have a couple of slides, and happy to go through that first. And then I wanted to remind everybody that if they have questions, they can ask it in the comment section below. And start with a Q, so we have the question. We know it's a question, not a statement. So maybe let's go through a couple of thoughts here, and I'll let you go through that. You tell me to next, and then I want to dig into some more questions I have myself.
Great, sure. So I guess we start with what we call the traditional approach to security. And this is how we see most organizations handling application security, software security, as well as compliance as it relates to software, which is you build code and then you find deviations, you find vulnerabilities, you find non-compliance, whether that's penetration testing, scans, some kind of audit, and you go back and you fix what you've identified. And we call this the find and fix approach. There are lots of great innovations in scanning to bring that even further and further to the left, but nonetheless, it's still reactive. You're finding an issue and then you're fixing it. There are problems with this. First of all, apart from being reactive, depending on what you find, the nature of fixing it may not be all that straightforward. It can be quite slow. But also, the scanning process, the testing processes are often opaque. We don't know exactly everything that those tools or processes are looking for. And so we don't know if we're truly building a secure and compliant product or not. Nonetheless, this has kind of become an industry standard accepted sort of view, or at least it had been for a while. And then it makes the ATO process quite complicated in the federal space, because you have software that's being shipped, and now you have to go back and essentially document how all of this complies with something like NIST 853, which leads to the cycles that Nick was talking about earlier. So maybe skip to the next slide. So our view is a slightly different approach, and it's really this concept of shift left, which is rather than waiting until you've written code to detect deviations, to detect security issues and compliance issues, before you start writing code, you can automatically derive what are the relevant set of security and compliance controls and requirements. And you can integrate them into the development process. and then you can validate whether or not they were completed. So you still do the scanning. That's still a very critical part of the whole process. It's not to take away from it, but rather it shouldn't be the only place. You shouldn't only be detecting vulnerabilities. You should be planning and preventing vulnerabilities and compliance issues from ever occurring. And by doing this, which is what SD Elements helps to do, and I'll talk about how it does that, we enable the concept of building compliance and by design, building security and by design, and having an audit trail, which then feeds into this whole concept of that Nick talked about continuous ATO. You can continuously produce artifacts that show the current state of software, and are they integrating security best practices? How are we looking from a compliance standpoint with NIST 153 or many other compliance documents? And so this has become really critical, because not only are we enabling continuous ATO, we're building more secure software and we're getting it out faster, right? And so that's really where the software has taken off. Next slide. So I'll walk through the workflow, quickly here. Obviously, if anyone's interested, happy to follow up afterwards and go into a little more detail. Have one of our folks reach out and set up a demo. But I just want to give you a sense of how the product works for the sake of time here. There's 5 kind of critical steps in the process. It starts with a survey or a way to characterize or identify the project that you're working on. And then that gets translated from really large documents and a bunch of best practices into very prescriptive, specific guidance that is tailored to a particular system, appropriate to the level of risk that your organization is willing to tolerate. And then those specific requirements are assigned to the correct people to work on it in the tools that they're already using. So Nick alluded to Jira, but we support many other issue tracking systems. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. So essentially, they have non-functional requirements that they're completing alongside all their functional work. And then we go to the verify or validate. So where security typically starts is at this step where you're doing scanning and testing. But what we do is we integrate with those systems and processes. So you're using a scanner, we can validate that a control was implemented or not, that there's a deviation and that someone has to go back and fix it. But instead of just getting a black box scan and getting a set of vulnerabilities, what you're getting is what were all the things we ought to have done, what was done, and where did we identify deviations. And finally, and very critically for the ATO standpoint, is reporting. So you can pull a report at any time on how are you complying with your own internal policies, how are you complying with regulatory standards, and a number of other ways to slice and dice the data. So let's go in a little more detail into each one of these steps. So this is kind of in lieu of a demo, but it'll give you a sense of how the product, how people interact with the product. So I talked about a survey. This is really the first step into the process. And it's a multiple choice survey. There's a couple ways that we can derive system information. You could use this interface, but to the extent that some of our customers have thousands of applications defined in upstream systems like a configuration management database, you can integrate into SD Elements or the API to answer these questions automatically. And what that will do is it will then give us some sense of a profile of that particular system. So if we go to the next step.
Sorry. You're too fast.
We then translate. So what that means is we look at the profile of this application. We have a knowledge base, one that we're continuously keeping up to date with a team of researchers, contractors, specialists, and a bunch of different technologies, programming languages, regulatory frameworks, and it's all kind of put together into one. And this is essentially where we can say, relevant to this specific system that you're building, here are the potential security weaknesses, issues, threats, but also what are the countermeasures or corresponding controls that you need to implement. And what it will do is it will make sure that the application that you're currently working on is classified, right, according to your own risk classification. And that's something that is quite configurable, and which we see, our customers take a lot of interest in. So you might say, for example, an internet-facing web application with PII is a critical risk system. And so the amount of security that you need to embed is quite different than something that is internal-facing, has no real confidential information. And so we're just not going to put the same amount of scrutiny on it. And so the level of security requirements and controls can be commensurate. So moving to the next step. This is where we now integrate in with the systems, typically the systems that developers are using. Now, you could use the SD Elements interface itself, but we have a number of customers that will integrate in with something like Jira. So you're minimizing the impact to the development teams. And Jira is just a obviously very popular example. We support many issue tracking systems. But what you'll see here is an example of what it would look like for the developer, which is essentially a specific control that they need to implement, but it's actionable, it's tactical, it'll contain specific code samples to the relevant programming language in some cases, and we'll have embedded training videos so that, for developers who are first seeing this kind of security issue, why is it important? Why should I work on it in the first place? All of that is wrapped up into sort of a ticket. And then once they implement it, that goes back into SD Elements. It's a two-way synchronization. And we're keeping track that the security controls are being implemented. So if we go to the next step, this is again where we tie in to the validation tool. So I just want to reiterate, we don't do code scanning. We don't find vulnerabilities. We help prevent vulnerabilities. But there are a host of tools that are really good at finding vulnerabilities. And so what we do is we integrate with those tools to tie back to the requirements and say, whether or not specific vulnerabilities were found for the particular controls that are relevant to this application. And so this gives you the sort of end-to-end view. And then what the last step here is the report. And this is an example of a NIST 853 report, obviously very relevant to the ATO use case, where what we're doing is we're saying, so for example, you're seeing an example of the true AC1 control in NIST 853. How does that tie back to a report in SD Elements? And what we do is we'll go section by section and say what was relevant to this particular project, what wasn't relevant, and for the ones that were relevant, were they implemented? Who were they implemented by? When were they implemented? And have an audit trail that essentially helps to confirm that in fact all the appropriate security controls were implemented for this particular product. So that's the process in a nutshell. There's lots more to the product. There's lots of customizations and integrations that I'm not going to get into today. I'm happy to talk further about that to anyone. But here are some of the organizations that are using SD Elements in the federal space. Obviously, we can't talk too much specifically to what we're doing in each one of these, but Nick talked about the work we had done with Platform One and Castle Run, and it really has just grown from there. I will point out these are the federal organizations. We have, of course, over the years, amassed a large group of Fortune 500 and other large commercial organizations that are using this at scale. And what I would say that we've often seen is, organizations might use thousands or tens of thousands of projects in SD Elements because it can scale so quickly, because we're not looking at code, we're not scanning code, and it's very lightweight to get started. And so in many cases, it's the most scalable part of an application security program and serves as the backbone because it's injecting in what ought to be done and then integrating in what has been validated. So again, that end-to-end assurance. And that aligns, by the way, very well with the NIST risk management framework, which I think has been a great value prop to our federal customers. Yeah,
and I believe you're hiring. So I know
yes.
It's tough to find good talent right now, but I wanted to point out some of the roles you're looking for now.
Yeah, no, it's a shameless plug here. We're definitely, always hiring right now. Some of the key roles that we're looking for: software engineer, head of our software engineering group, a vice president. Quite a few in the marketing space as well as sales. Security researchers. So those are the people who help us to generate the content and keep up to date with what's happening from a regulatory compliance as well as technology standpoint. And of course, the developers themselves, which is a role where we're constantly looking for as we grow. So if you're interested, please, apply directly, securitycampus.com/careers. Also, we have our postings all on LinkedIn. So definitely, please feel free to apply if it interests you.
Tell us, what kind of background are you looking for when you're looking for a security researcher specifically? What's the right background for someone like that?
That's an interesting one because I think there's no one specific background. We've had many people come from academia, as well as people who come from sort of practitioner standpoint. So somebody who's done application security analysis and has done threat modeling and these sorts of things, or has done compliance in software, and wants to play a greater role in making sure that more organizations can do this in a seamless way. But they have the technical background to understand the nuances of secure coding. I guess that's really the core is they really have to be able to pick up quickly on application security and or compliance. But like I said, sometimes we have people who have done these sorts of things in academia and they've gone straight into this field, or they've had more practical sort of hands-on experience, but less of an academic background. And we bring those two things together, and I think it works really well in terms of developing the content. So either of those would work.
So a couple of people had question about integrations, right? You talk about Atlassian Jira. I know Kim was asking what kind of integration you have with Jira, but also people were asking at the same time about ServiceNow, Alter, right? So I'm gonna group those questions into the same bucket. Chris was asking, do you also integrate with traditional GRC system like Alter, and EMAS is more like a DoD one, but have you had any interactions with those guys?
Yeah, I think the answer broadly is, okay, those are two different classes of integration. So let me start with Jira. Jira is sort of first order integration for us. It's something we've had for a decade or more, but we've expanded well beyond Jira. And what I'll maybe ask one of the folks on our team who's listening to maybe post a link to the complete set of integrations. Have that posted? Okay, perfect.
They did. It's already there.
I knew they would. Thanks, Norm. But just to maybe go into a little bit more, the nature of the integration is essentially to take this set of security controls that's relevant to this particular project that you're working on and integrate it into a Jira project so that they're, they appear as tickets or user stories, depending. There's a lot of different ways to configure it, and you can get quite sophisticated with a Jira integration, but essentially it shows up in a backlog of some kind, and then it can be groomed accordingly and assigned to individual developers or people in the development team, just as you would a functional story. And that way you're not significantly altering the process, nor are you asking most of the people in that team to use a different tool, which is what we found to be really effective in helping gain adoption. So that's that side of things. Moving over to the GRC solutions, I think you will see in integrations. Integrating with GRC is not straightforward because there's no out of the box. Everybody uses the integration one way. Archer, is a good example where there's sort of a million different ways that you can set up Archer. So we do have integrations into a number of these tools, but they have to be customized a bit because simply there is no. It's not like Jira where there's sort of
it's not cookie cutter.
But we do, and by way of the EMAS integrations, that is certainly something that we hear on the federal side. What we do with our reporting is we allow capability to export all of the reports into formats that a lot of these tools are able to integrate. So I can't talk too specifically myself to the EMAS SD Elements integration, and maybe someone in our team can, but I believe that people have done this to some degree of success. There you are. So there's a out of the box one that's in progress with the API, but importing reporting data is possible, and that's I think what most of the customers are doing now for any integration that we don't have out of the box.
So when you looked at some of the adoption you had, with teams like SRN and others, what was the big challenges they were facing when adopting the product? And when you look back at what you learned in the last 3 years, what were the big changes you ended up making that were kind of pushed from the government side, but also benefited your commercial customers? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not a company that has more customers from the government compared to the commercial side, right? So you have more commercial customers, which is usually pretty rare, and I prefer it that way. So I think people are not completely biased by the government nonsense. So I'd like to see if you had any lessons learned that came from the government side that also benefited the commercial side.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I break it up into sort of two pieces. I think there's the usage and the features of the product, and then there's the deployment. Going through Platform One and an Iron Bank process, which I'm sure you've seen other commercial tools. That's a maybe not trivial amount of work, but it's beneficial to everybody. I mean, it's you're increasing the security of your own, not just the product that you're building, but the downstream components, right? And making sure that pressure is sort of applied across the board. So I think that's just beneficial to everybody. I think the whole Iron Bank concept is beneficial to the entire ecosystem. If I think about the features, I would say from my perspective, I'm not sure that they've been wildly different on the federal side than they have on the commercial side. And not to say they're completely the same. There are certain requests, for example, certain kinds of content, like the STIGs, for example, that are quite relevant to the DoD and maybe not so relevant outside.
Yeah.
But and I would say there are some features that are related to things like that, content, integrations, for example, that are specific to DoD. But the typical challenges that we would see in any implementation are the change, right? The change from find and fix to plan and prevent is a big one, because most software development shops are not used to owning security right from the start. They're used to building something and then giving it to sort of the experts to find issues and go back and fix it. And so the process changes. You don't just have your sort of initial planning session and then go into writing code right away. Now there's a piece of analysis that happens up front, and the development teams are taking ownership of it. So that comes with a bit of friction often, right? Like, people are not used to doing it. It means work up front that didn't exist. So some of the things that we have heard as feedback, both in DoD as well as in the commercial side, is we don't want too much of this work up front, right? Like, as we start to use this, if you tell me there are 140 security controls, I'm just going to ignore the whole thing and I'm going to go back to doing what I'm doing, right? And the reality is there are 140 security controls in some cases, right? But you got to bite off. If you try and bite off more than you can chew, the whole thing isn't effective. So, I mentioned this concept of a risk policy. This is a feature that, we got a lot of feedback on, that there's too much. So how can we dial back and say, I only want to focus on the most critical things to begin with, and over time, I want to be able to ratchet that up a little bit and add more security controls. And so that was really good feedback. It's something that's now sort of a first order part of the product. Along with that is this concept of risk classification. This is something, again, we got a lot of feedback on, I think both, across the board, which is if I have 1,000 applications, I need to know where I'm going to focus my energy. And I can't have some generic vendor proprietary way of classifying it. My org already has a way of classifying applications, and I need you to be able to support that. So that was a really big, important part of, our workflow that I talked about, is the ability to classify automatically. We hear feedback about, I mentioned the survey, and being able to integrate and automate ingest data from other systems. So that's, been something that I think has come both from the commercial and federal side, the ability to automate some parts of that. And then I would say reporting is, there are some specific needs in the federal space that are different in the commercial space from a reporting perspective. Usually, commercial organizations just do not typically have the same amount of scrutiny and software development, at least from my experience. You could have no audit trail integrating security in and still not break any laws in the commercial space. And that's what most people do, right? Whereas in the federal space, you really have to have the right amount of documentation, the right audit trails. Why are you doing something? Why are you not doing something? Right? That's relevant, I think, more so in the federal space than it is in the commercial. But all those things became sort of first order features of the product as we listen to the federal customers.
And do you find that organizations that have regulations, right, whether it's in finance or healthcare, do you find that those organizations will be a better fit for you guys because of the regulations? Is that kind of helping drive yourselves?
Yeah, I would say we've had the most success in heavily regulated organizations for the most part. We're starting to see a change, because I would say even 2 years ago, when DevSecOps was still, I'll say, nascent, like obviously it had been around for a few years, but not many I don't know, not many organizations had adopted it just yet. It was more the early adopters. Now we're starting to see it become more mainstream. What's happening is that the nature of what is industry best practice is changing. And so you hear the concept of shift left. You hear things like security requirements and threat modeling, secure by design as being kind of a first order problem that even if a law doesn't require you to do it, you can still you still should be doing it. And I think that's just change that we've started to see in the market. And now we're seeing more, software companies that aren't particularly regulated. Although I will add, with the executive order and the software supply chain security stream of work, and particularly the NIST software security development framework, we believe that's going to have a pretty big impact, even more impact on software developers, even the ones who maybe aren't embracing DevSecOps and shift left today, because they're going to need to do this.
Yeah, and Jim asked a question. I'm going to take that one proudly, but you can also share your thoughts. But he asked, can a vendor engage a firm that specializes in the ATO process to assist the vendor in getting an ATO? And how necessary is it to have a mission partner to sponsor the ATO? Is that the first most important step? So David kind of answered a little bit, talking about the 3 PAOs, the FedRAMP process to have an authorization. And of course, having government sponsorship is required for FedRAMP and is a good signal. And of course, before investing, that's a good signal to have. I also have helped about 250 companies that had no traction whatsoever in government yet, but I knew that they had tremendous traction on the commercial side, and it would be a great fit on the government side as well by enabling them to go on Iron Bank. So I put kind of the link to get your container. So if you containerize and you want to get an ATO for your certificate to field effectively for your container, you want to go on Iron Bank and do the onboarding process. You don't need a sponsorship, and you can just do it pretty. Depending on the company and where you are in your cyber maturity and whether you containerize or not containerize, it could be as little as 2 weeks. We've seen companies do it in 2 weeks, all the way to a year. But I would say the average is probably 3 months for the first time, and then it's very automated for the next releases. So I think there's some lift. There's not tons of people. I mean, I'm talking really maybe 1 or 2 person for a few weeks to get this done, assuming you already containerized. So I think it's a great thing to do, because honestly, it's kind of the chicken and the egg problem. Most agencies are not very eager to sponsor the first ATO because it takes forever, and it's going to take a lot of their time. If you already have at least a certificate to field in Iron Bank, which is kind of an ATO for that container, then you can really get already on contract, and you can even go after CBIRs, which are grants. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. I would recommend proactively doing it, particularly if it's a low-hanging fruit lift and it's not a big amount of work. Also, when it comes to vendor helping firms, well, there are a couple of companies, right, that help. Platform One has just awarded the reseller agreement to help companies get their container on Iron Bank, for example. So you could pay some of the resellers, the TMO does it, OTEEMO. You have, all the reseller on the Platform One contract that have the reseller agreement can also help there get your container hardened and on Iron Bank. So you could hire a company to do that. It's not very expensive. It's pretty simple. I mean, is it good to have some good discussion already to justify the cost? Maybe, but if I wouldn't go there for my first industry. I would probably start on the commercial side first. But if you have good traction and you want to expand, the government is a great opportunity. It's huge. It's slow a little bit, but the fact is it's massive and big money. And also, we need to win against China. So if you want to win against China, we want to have best of breed, and we need to convince companies to participate. And also, if you're a smaller business, you can get a grant, a CBIR, SBIR, and you can, get up to a $3 million, phase 2, phase 3 grant. And you don't lose equity, you don't lose anything. And it's, a great way to customize your product for government needs and and without having to invest your own money. So I would argue, look at Sybers and then look at Iron Bank. FedRAMP is the last thing I would do. FedRAMP is a massive lift. It's probably $1 million, investment, and Iron Bank gets you to all classification levels much more effectively than FedRAMP. And there are 12 agencies outside of DoD using Iron Bank now. 5 nations also outside of the US also started to use Iron Bank as well. So I think it's going to grow, and I think it's a very good investment. But again, I'm probably biased because I built it. So, all right. So wanted to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to bring one of the slide you had, that the survey slide, right? That you had, where you kind of help, right? And that was kind of the first thing that got me intrigued about the product. You kind of help, don't select or like categorize your, and I wouldn't use the word classification, by the way, on your site anymore for any federal customers, because when you say it's classified, then everybody thinks actual classified stuff. I would call it categorizing or whatever, right? But not classified. So anyway, the survey helps you, right, first kind of define a little bit what the application is about. Is it a web app? Is it an embedded system? And I like that you support, client, web client, mobile, standalone apps, firmware, even embedded hardware stuff, right? So you're not just a, cool enabler for web apps, right? You support effectively pretty much the entire spectrum. And I love for you also to give us a little bit of insights where you see the trends moving when it comes to the adoption of microservices and even serverless, and what is going to change once people move to serverless and more microservice driven architecture. What is that going to change for your product and for the way we even assess these Lego blocks?
Well, I think, it's a really good question. And I think that the way we look at microservices is it's an evolution. I think it's trendy and has been for a while. And some people have been quick to embrace it in the right way and make it core to the way they develop. Others, I think, are sort of still playing with the concept, really coming to grips with what it means. But there's no doubt that it's the way that software development is going, right? So it's like, DevSecOps. Maybe people could say it was an emergent trend at some point, but now you have to say it's unstoppable, right? It will take over. And so I think the same thing with microservices. And so I think, not just in our product, but when we think about security, just like in general in microservices, you're thinking about architecture, you have to start thinking about a composite of many different pieces working together, as opposed to one assessment. And you talked about this before with the concept of layers, right? Which is that's for us a key driver for our concept of having components in the system, right? Which is essentially something that we'll be working. We have already started to develop and will be coming out this year. Is the idea of being able to model each of these microservices independently, and then bring them together for a composite view. So basically, what are the security controls that just that service has to have? Right. And then when you put them all together, right, what does that mean for the aggregate system? But also, really importantly, if you're building on top of microservices, what is it that you don't need to do anymore, right? In this like custom code layer that's leveraging the microservices. And as you change a microservice, right, what does that mean then to the composite, right? Are you now less secure or more secure, which is the same concept as any other layer, right, which you've been talking about. So you switch from one cloud provider to another cloud provider. What does that mean for your overall security posture? So that is a big part of our evolution, our roadmap this year and last year that will make this even more natural and sort of seamlessly integrate into the system. But I do think it's going to generally be a problem, because it not only is challenging to do it in the security requirements phase, even when you get to things like testing and doing assessments, you have the same problem. Are you sort of scanning each component, right? And when you come up with sort of the audit, your verification findings, is it an aggregate of all of these scans? Are you trying to do a scan of one monolithic code base? All of these tools and systems have to keep up with the change from having sort of one monolithic system to being able to aggregate a bunch of disparate pieces and show kind of a real-time snapshot of where things are today. So that's definitely guiding our product direction. I think it's guiding a lot of product directions, but not everything will keep up. So we're going to see some things, I think, that have been really popular in years past start to fade away, and we start to use more nimble approaches that allow for this architecture view.
Yeah, and what you can see here on the screenshot, you have all these tabs on the left where you can define the protocols used, right? What kind of requirements you have to follow, the test tool and the test suite you're using, and kind of the language, right? The platform you're using. So because people, of course, when you move to microservices, you could have a set of microservices on top of Knative on serverless, some in Lambda, and some maybe on top of just containers on top of Kubernetes. So that changed your inheritance of some controls that are inherited through that orchestration stack.
Yeah,
that makes life pretty complex. I think the issue with the ATO today in most of the normal government nonsense is that it's a full system. Effectively, it's already kind of components, but they are, like you said, grouped into a single view, but no one really does the work. It would be so much work to do it per component, particularly when you have big primes with a bunch of subs, and the subs have different libraries and different things they're using. If you have to do every library that's being used and map it to NIST, and no one would do anything, right, and get anything done. So the inheritance and the orchestration enforcement and the service mesh, that's why we push the service mesh to be able to enforce zero trust and different things as a sidecar container that does not get embedded inside of the container. So that way the sidecar container is kind of augmenting and can be updated in a decoupled fashion from the container. So we don't have to reach out to the 300 or 700 teams to tell them, hey, you have to update this library in your container because my cyber product has a new update. This is seamless, right? And so, when you start thinking of those concepts, the decoupling and the enablement, the more people understand, for example, the concept of a sidecar container, and the more you can do either at the orchestration layer, at the node on Kubernetes, or at the sidecar layer, the more you can then centralize that cyber enforcement, whether it's a reverse proxy like Envoy, whether it's a continuous behavior detection mechanism that's going to continuously monitor the stack. And but even the reverse proxy can be an enforcement for your mutual TLS tunnel, right? So now by mandating and enforcing Istio in enforcement mode, I know that all the traffic I have is going to be using MTLS crypto. So now really I don't need to ask all of my components to worry about whether or not they use MTLS, because we know they have it. And more importantly, I know which bits they're using to do the crypto because I'm providing the sidecar. And the sidecar, if I have new updates of the TLS bits, I can do it centrally without even have to worry about it. And oh, by the way, my certificate management and orchestration of my certificates is now down at the service mesh layer and now done per team. Yeah. So when you start embracing this concept, that's pretty game changing and changing the way you think about meeting controls, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the end game, right? So many people who work in at least the application security space really want a kind of an end game where developers are doing as little security work as possible. It's all embedded. It's all happening seamlessly. They don't have to think about it. The reality is we're not there today in most software. I think many of the things you've talked about are bringing us much closer. And if we don't have something like this that's giving us the aggregated view of how all these pieces work together, so you know what you need to do and what you don't need to do, I think it's going to be really difficult for us to understand what work needs to be done by the developer, what work is being done by the various components, what you need to enable, what you don't need to enable, where you might have conflicts between two different, say for example TLS being turned on, whether it's there's so many different ways to do it, right? And so many different components that could be handling it. So understanding which component is handling that, so you don't have to enforce it, say in the other components. Like all of that view is really difficult, and I think we're going to play a central role in making that happen. And the survey will change as we see more and more people kind of embrace the component world and microservices, and these become smaller. The amount that you have to define for each component becomes smaller. And like I said, it's more about the aggregate of everything together.
Yeah, and I guess I have a question from a guest, but before we take that question, I wanted to ask you a last question on my side. But
Sure.
what kind of made you get engaged on the federal side? And of course, you're Canadian. People maybe don't know that. So what made you initially get involved with the government?
Well, I think many years ago now.
You're so old. You're
Sorry?
so old. You're so old.
That's right.
many
decades ago.
Yeah.
I say, relative to when we started working with the government, probably, I'd say like 6 years before that, we had people who worked here, who had worked in the DoD,
I see.
worked in federal government. They said there's an absolute need for the government, the federal government, to use this product. But it's not going to be quick for us to get in. And I think that's, just the general case for a lot of software. We in particular, I'm just going to highlight the DIUX program that they had a mandate to go out and look for innovative technology companies, and that was something that was relatively new. I think when it came out, that whole concept of it being very difficult to get the government to adopt something that wasn't already in the government, or made by perhaps the companies that are already in the government. They made that a lot easier, right? Like it's truly sort of about merit and what the federal sector needs, and I think that helped us tremendously. Even though we know the need had been around for a long time, getting our foot in the door, getting people to just be able to evaluate it and then make the connections to say, hey, I think this could be useful, in for example, in Kessel Run, right? So we always knew it, and we know it's true not just in the federal government. We know it's true in state and local and governments around the world. They all have the same challenge to some extent, maybe not to the same degree of scrutiny as the DoD, but definitely this idea of documentation, ATO or CNA processes or anything along those lines that really slow down software development. We think it's just a matter of time before every government starts to embrace this kind of approach. So it's always been a big part of our future.
And which one was your first customer on the US side? Was it on the government side? Was it Kessel Run?
Well, it was depends how you classify.
Classify.
Depends how you categorize it. DIUX was sort of our first inroad in, but Kessel Run was the first real, production program, if you will. And that's we just sort of expanded from there. I think that's where we met you when we were in Kessel Run.
Right. So let's see. The question is actually pretty interesting. When you look at the survey being conducted, what kind of recommendations do you have, right, on how do you help teams establish their risk thresholds? And do you find it to be dependent on the compliance framework that the teams are seeking for the ATO?
Well, okay. So there's a couple ways to answer this question. So first of all, I want to point out that it's really important to us in something like this is not plug and play. It's because there's just so many different ways that you can integrate into your processes and integrate into your systems. And this is a good example. Very good question. Your foundational risk threshold is going to be different per organization. So we have spent a lot of time and invested a lot in coming up with not just a product, but a solution that involves people, process, technology. And so, we have a group of people who are experts who help our customers in the onboarding process to make sure that we take basically the best practices we've learned from all of our customers and say, what we understand for organizations that are similar to yours is this is the kind of risk threshold we typically find when they first roll it out. And it is, there's sort of a loaded question. It's dependent on the compliance framework the team is seeking for the ATO. It's not always driven by compliance. Sometimes it's driven just by a desire, like a risk management desire to integrate security in, and compliance is sort of a byproduct. But in the case where compliance is the core, then yes, that does have an impact. And you have obviously the baseline levels and NIST 853. Those are things that help to inform what degree of security controls you want to put in. But again, often we will help people to walk before they run. Just get used to the concept of integrating security requirements and security controls into the process before you really expose all of the work that it takes to build a completely secure system, because it often is more than people realize if they haven't done it before.
Yeah, and I guess Kim has always great questions. So she's asking why don't you have Splunk on your integration list, and she's also asking about the product Phantom that's now called the Splunk SOAR, SOAR, which does kind of the fixing and she called it the self-healing. I guess you could call it that, but it's really a SOAR, right? So, what's your vision long term? In fact, when you start looking at the kind of the SOAR market, right? And I guess for people that don't know what a SOAR is, it's kind of security orchestration stack that will be able to take action and also fix things as well. So it's called a security orchestration, automation, and response. So there's a lot of automated reaction to whatever the SIEM is seeing and responding. It could be blocking things, or it could be changing the access control or whatever, right? Do you find obviously that's on the runtime side. Do you see a future where that's something you want to think about in terms of integrating with a SOAR, or what's there?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is we're sort of like the ultimate shift left, right? We're at the very beginning of a development. Most security, not most, but many security products, including SOAR platforms, right, are about detection, response. There are maybe a prevention as well, but they're runtime, like you mentioned. So detecting attacks on the network happening now and responding appropriately. I do see a future where we're becoming more and more tightly integrated with that class of tools. I think we're not getting a lot. I'll say, candidly, we're not getting a lot of requests for this from our customer base, because it's a pretty broad spectrum to go from sort of shift left, integrate security requirements into kind of tying it in to what you're seeing on the perimeter today. I do think as DevSecOps matures and organizations mature, we're going to see more and more demand for that. So I think Splunk is probably one of the ones we'll hear more about in the future. It's not on the integration list today simply because it's not something that I think many of our customers would take advantage of from an integration perspective yet. But I do think that would change. I don't know. I can't speak to Phantom. I'm not familiar with it specifically, so I apologize. But
it's called SOAR now, so it's not even called Phantom anymore.
Okay. So yeah, so SOAR products in general, I think they tie really well into this concept, because ideally what would happen is, as we detect the things that are happening in the network, that can help us inform the prevention side and say, for example, if we think a control is really important, well, why is it so important? Right? We can be informed by what we're seeing in the perimeter and educate the developers and the DevOps teams that this is why it's really important. So I do think that's an evolution. I just don't think the industry is quite there yet, but it's good. It's a good question to ask.
Yeah, it's getting there. I think it's just a matter of time. And I guess Teddy had a great question also on how do you link the system risk analysis with the threat modeling of the containers, and how do you set the risk appetite when you look at the container level as well? So that's always an interesting comparison. When you look at the threat modeling, for me in DoD was always challenging because effectively everything is a threat. So I wasn't spending a lot of time in DoD because I felt like, we're targeted even for basic applications. That's going to be a foothold inside of the DoD's network. So we're going to be targeted by nation states regardless. And then, we we kind of did a hardening guide for containers to mitigate a lot of the threat. And when you start adding moving target defense, and you start adding behavior detection, and you start adding zero trust to mitigate lateral movement and the attack surface, that was a lot of kind of baked in security. But when you look at the system risk analysis, how do you see people doing the threat modeling as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a very interesting question. So I think Teddy might be asking this question because if you go to our website, you'll see one of the use cases that people use us for is threat modeling. Now, sometimes that isn't super intuitive because we have an idea of what threat modeling looks like in our head. I'll maybe take a step back. There's sort of, I think, two very popular views of threat modeling. One being like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, attacker-centric threat modeling. Yep. And then you have sort of the Microsoft STRIDE framework, which is really more for the software development teams. So I'd say like that, when we talk about threat modeling, we're really talking about the defensive or defenders version of threat modeling. And while we don't do data flow diagrams and attack trees and that sort of thing, it's because what we really are interested in is the goal of threat modeling, right? Which is to understand what you're essentially, what security risks we care about and what we're going to do to implement them, and which ones we're just not going to do anything about. And so like SD Elements helps to come to that end goal in a really fast way, right? So we call our approach sort of developer-centric threat modeling. We really cater to how the developers can move quickly, admittedly without some of the kind of analysis that you would typically expect out of things like data flow diagrams. But this is something that we have seen many of our customers embrace. And I think the question is really, if I peel it back a little bit, it's similar, Nick, to your point about microservices, which is, you have a system risk analysis, but what about if you go to an individual component, or if we're talking about deployments in a container, and how do you set risk appetite for that particular container? And what I would say is, from our product standpoint, you could do that today. You could just model a particular container, and you can answer the questions relevant to that container. And what we are in the midst of shipping out or building, I should say, is the ability to get that system view in one snapshot, but you can still aggregate the components together and get a view through sort of individual reports. So it is possible to do. The degree to which people do that, I think, depends on each organization and how much work they're willing to put in. If you have 1,000, containers, it's obviously a lot of work to do that. But it can be done. Let me put it that way. So it's technically possible. This is really more a question about process than it is about technical capabilities.
That makes sense. So I guess, final question for me, when you look at what's coming with, the state of cybersecurity and the breaches, and, people start to care a little bit more, I feel, about cyber and not just compliance. What did that mean? Did you see more companies reaching out, companies that used not to care now, talking about software bill of material, and you talk about the present executive order and all that thing? What did you think there, and what's happening in the last 6 months, a year? Do you see any progress there as well?
Yeah, I do. I think, I mentioned that the trend of DevSecOps has made shift left interesting. Now, some people have interpreted that as testing earlier, and that's part of shift left, I think. But I think more and more people are understanding there's sort of a gap there from secure by design, and you can see it in a few different places. So I referenced the executive order and the work that NIST is doing in particular with the software security development framework, or secure software development framework, which is going to be enforced, I think, in the next couple of years in various stages. And so I do think we're starting to see some companies proactively say this is something I need to address. But it's not the only place where we're seeing it. So, for example, OWASP, which is really widely followed, in particular the OWASP Top 10 is sort of their, I'll say, key project that most people know about. And the OWASP Top 10 in 2021 introduced insecure design as one of the top 10 security risks, which is interesting because it's kind of it's related to all of them, but they felt it was necessary to call it out because it was the kind of thing that if it wasn't called out, maybe people weren't explicitly doing it. But now it's on the radar of lots of people who, many different compliance standards point to the OWASP Top 10 and say, you should be integrating the OWASP Top 10 into your development process. So we're starting to see that emerge as well. And then even things like PCI, the payment card industry, they've changed their stance on software security. They have a software security, secure software framework that's used initially in payment applications, but will also be referenced in the more popular data security standard. So just generally, we're starting to see more and more, awareness of security by design. And that is, in fact, I think, creating a better understanding of this sort of category of need.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess there's a question here. I don't know the name, but and this SD element, but we'll ignore the typo here. Provide. So do you provide a cross compliance security framework that includes a compliance framework web or documentation control crosswalk that includes multiple programs that will require evidence and control that are similar but not exactly the same? For example, FedRAMP, SOC, PCI. I know that's a kind of a key feature of the product. I believe probably it's even more important on the commercial side when companies have to follow multiple compliance requirements.
Yeah,
kind of what the GRC tool will do too, right?
You're right. I didn't highlight that, but that is absolutely a core part of what we do. Is we normalize amongst many different compliance requirements. And without going into a full demo, if you looked at one of the tasks in SD Elements, it would have sort of the generic, I'll say, not specific to any particular compliance requirement, but the work that the development team needs to do. But it will also have some contextual information for each relevant compliance standard that may show something a little bit different. Say in FedRAMP, well, not Fed, NIST 153 might say something in particular, and then you might have like ISO 27001 saying something slightly different. And so we would talk through what are the differences, inside of that particular ticket. So you get the general control that you need to implement, and then you understand the nuanced differences between the frameworks.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's probably a key feature particularly for the commercial side. But I think even in the government, I guess there's a few compliance requirements, particularly if you deal with healthcare data that could also apply. So that's also much easier when you don't have to do it per compliance requirement. That'll be painful enough.
Yeah, and what we find often is an agency or a company may have their own internal standards, right, that they want to push out and treat it as kind of an internal compliance. And so you want to see how you're complying against your own standards, as well as an external regulatory standard, as well as some best practice framework that you want to be able to report to the board about, right? So you can normalize all those things together.
Yeah, that makes sense. So wanted to thank you again for joining us. This was a great session, and I hope people were able to understand kind of the beauty of having that kind of automation and streamlining the nightmare that is the control mapping and prioritization. I wanted to also remind everybody to register for the AMA so they can be here for next Tuesday, 1 p.m. We're going to have Jason Weiss, the DoD Chief Software Officer, the first ever Chief Software Officer of the department, join us on Tuesday, 1 p.m. So don't miss that one. That's going to be fun. You can come and ask all your questions, but also follow the In the Nick of Time page on LinkedIn here, so you can also get more comments and news about what's going on in the world. Wanted to thank everybody for joining us again. Don't forget to join us next Tuesday. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep pushing the good fight so we can have a chance to win against China. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nick.